Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Healthy Hot Water Distribution Systems. My name is Hannah Bashan, and I will be your moderator today. In this session, we will discuss how properly designing, operating, and maintaining hot water distribution systems can reduce health risks to building occupants. This topic is especially important in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, as many buildings have remained unoccupied for months and could potentially have bacteria buildup from stagnant water. In today's session, our speakers will provide an overview of healthy hot water distribution systems, best practices, and discuss safety considerations and lessons for buildings in response to the current pandemic. Before we begin, I do have a few housekeeping announcements. Your screen is customizable, so feel free to make the various windows as large or as small as you would like, and you can even minimize them to drop to the menu at the bottom of your screen. Presentations can be downloaded as PDFs from the resource list in the menu. Attendees are in listen-only mode, but can submit questions through the Q&A box at any time during the webcast. The presenters will respond to questions throughout and at the end of the presentations. The Q&A can be accessed in the menu at the bottom of your screen if it is not already visible. All presentations will be available for on-demand viewing within a few days on the Engagement Hub. And then at the end of our session, we will open up chat rooms on the Zoom platform for anyone who wishes to continue the conversation regarding the session or to ask further questions of the presenters. To access the Zoom chat, there's a chat room icon in your menu bar with the link. And on behalf of ACEEE, we want to recognize and thank our sponsors for this event. The first of which are Ream and A.O. Smith, our platinum sponsors. And the second are silver sponsors of Bradford White, Green Power EMC, Jackson EMC, NIA, SoCal Gas, and Sempra Energy. So to kick it off, I would like to introduce our distinguished panel of speakers. They are Amy Pruden, Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Virginia Tech, William Rhodes, Postdoctoral Researcher at Virginia Tech, and Tim Keene, a Consulting Engineer with Legionella Risk Management, Inc. We'll start with our first speaker, Amy Pruden. Amy is the W. Thomas Price Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Virginia Tech. Her research focuses on bringing a microbial ecological perspective to controlling pathogens in engineered water systems. Today, she will be sharing findings from her report for the National Academy of Sciences on Legionella and plumbing design. So I will turn this over to Amy.
Well, thank you very much, Hannah, and I appreciate the invitation to join you all here today at the Hot Water Forum and kick off this session. I'll be providing you with an overview of the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine report on management of Legionella in water systems, and this came out last September, and I think was quite timely. And I also want to acknowledge Michelle Prevost at Montreal Polytechnic as she helped with this presentation. Note that this was a consensus report derived from a committee of experts on various aspects of Legionella. Over a 2-year period, we had several face-to-face meetings, including public forums and expert presentations, to work out the details of the report, gain input, feedback, and ultimately consensus. Here is an overview of our statement of task and what is covered in the report. And the report basically follows this outline: ecology and diagnosis, transmission via water systems, quantification, prevention and control, and policy and training issues. So I'm going to go through and highlight each of these sections and mainly focus on the recommendations that emerged from the report. So firstly, just so we know what Legionnaires' disease is, it is a severe form of pneumonia with a high death rate. It's caused by inhaling tiny droplets of water called aerosols that contain the bacteria belonging to the genus Legionella. Where do these aerosols come from? Well, obviously, since I'm here today, engineered water systems, and that includes showers and faucets, also cooling towers, hot tubs, and decorative fountains. I won't dwell on the introductory chapter too much, but will highlight these data here, which were a main motivator for the academies to invest in this study. Legionnaires' disease is making a lot of people sick, and it's doing so at an increasing and alarming rate. So here in the US, as shown by the proportion of these bars that's shaded in black, and this is a problem throughout much of the rest of the world as well. These numbers keep increasing. So chapter 2 focuses on the microbial ecology of Legionella with the aim of understanding why is it prone to growth in water systems. And this sets a backdrop with respect to what we might do about it. Notably, there are many different kinds of Legionella, 61 species to be exact, but Legionella pneumophila is the one that is most frequently isolated from patients. From there, you'll hear about different serogroups and sequence types, and this helps to track the source of an outbreak by providing a fingerprint of sorts. But unfortunately for us, Legionella can feel quite at home in the plumbing environment. And in particular, they like to grow in biofilms, and they replicate there within free-living amoebae that slither along and graze on these biofilms. After replication, they're released from the amoebae in an infective and virulent, that's disease-causing, form, and ready to be inhaled when the water is sprayed and aerosolized. In terms of recommendations, I would generally boil these down into an interest in better understanding the exact conditions that make Legionella of all species and serogroups and serotypes grow in plumbing, and to be released in a form that causes disease. The next chapter, chapter 3, relates both to how we test for Legionella, both in patients and in water, and what we know from monitoring has been done on the rates of disease. This triangle here illustrates that only the tip of the iceberg really ends up being diagnosed and reported to the CDC. A major contribution of the report, in my mind, is an independent analysis of available data, suggesting that even though we know rates of Legionnaire's disease infections are increasing around the world, that the numbers are probably about 10 times worse than we thought. Often you hear the number 8 to 18,000 cases per year, but when you factor in the widespread underreporting that's going on, then the likely number is 52 to 70,000 cases per year in the US. Another major contribution of the report is a step towards a non-zero action level for Legionella colony-forming units. The rationale is that you're going to get Legionella hits here and there when you test pretty much any water source, and that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a risk of outbreak. And I probably don't need to tell you all that a great deal of money can be wasted trying to achieve an unrealistic goal of zero Legionella. So here we examined reported levels of Legionella in absence of outbreak and when there is a known outbreak to identify a conservative threshold of 50,000 CFU per liter as an action level to warrant remediation. But we recognize that a lower level might be warranted when you have at-risk individuals, but this is a starting place. These are the specific recommendations from Chapter 3. First is better clinical tools that capture more cases of Legionnaires, not just those caused by serogroup 1, which is what the urine antigen test captures. The second is to get a better handle on sporadic or non-outbreak disease. That was a big highlight motivating the report is actually, we talk about outbreaks, but 95% of Legionella cases are not outbreak associated. And it was suggested that regional centers of excellence could help to support and build up the capacity of state health departments to detect and investigate cases of disease. We also called out the need for more sensitive and reliable methods for monitoring, and finally, for the incorporation of quantitative microbial risk assessment to inform monitoring and regulations and get more confidence in the estimate for action level. Chapter 4 then delves into strategies for the control of Legionella in buildings. The main ones you will find are illustrated in this figure, ranging from elevated temperatures to addition of disinfectant, hydraulic design, and plumbing materials. An important point here is that none of these control strategies act in isolation, that you really need an integrated perspective adapted to the system of interest. For example, hydraulic design is not simply washing the Legionella out of the system, but it's ensuring that disinfectants and hot water are being effectively delivered to kill the Legionella. And in fact, from the literature review, I'm sure this audience would be interested to know that we found that maintaining elevated temperature throughout the hot water plumbing was the overarching factor in keeping Legionella numbers low and reducing risk of outbreak. And thus our recommendations were that hot water temperatures should be maintained above 60 degrees Celsius and at least 55 degrees Celsius to the distal points. We also noted that monochloramine tends to be more effective than free chlorine for Legionella control, but we understand this can be situation specific. We also talked about how much of the guidelines are focused on large institutional buildings, but if most Legionella cases, 95%, are indeed sporadic, then it would be good to have guidance for homeowners as well. Finally, we came out strong against low flow fixtures and green water features in high-risk environments, and also recommended new designs for cooling towers to avoid growth of Legionella and opportunity for people to be exposed to contaminated aerosols. And finally, I personally found Chapter 5 to be one of the more interesting chapters. It provides a legal framework in the US, what is our legal framework, and also looks at how other countries are addressing the problem. Number one, the Safe Drinking Water Act, unfortunately, does not provide protection from Legionella. All of the focus tends to be at the building management and liability level in the US. Yet, following Flint, Michigan, we are seeing examples wherein municipal water supply is a key factor in triggering Legionnaires' disease outbreak. Yes, building plumbing is more vulnerable than water mains to Legionella growth due to factors like the high pipe surface area, depleted disinfectants, and warm temperatures, but changes in the municipal water supply can trigger growth in building plumbing as well. And here is a summary of how Legionella is managed in the US. There are 4 examples of regulations covering Legionella. Both healthcare and cooling towers in New York State, which became highly vigilant about Legionella following the 2015 Brooklyn outbreak. The third is all Veterans Administration hospitals. And the fourth, most recently, actually as of 2017, all hospitals receiving Medicare, Medicaid funding must have a water management plan. Otherwise, Legionella control has been largely voluntary for public buildings, many of which choose to follow ASHRAE 188. And for private residences, we really only have the building and plumbing codes, which are pretty much silent on Legionella. And I can't spend too much time here, but here is a summary of how Legionella is handled in other countries. I think this table illustrates some nice points, that many other developed countries have regulations that all do require monitoring and Legionella, that temperature control is common, threshold concentrations differ, but none are based on a risk assessment. Our recommendations, we would like to see required monitoring of Legionella in all hospitals, registering and monitoring of cooling towers, required water management plans in all public buildings, requiring elevated water temperatures, and minimum disinfectant residuals throughout the public water systems. So that was pretty much a whirlwind tour of the report, and I hope that I've helped capture your interest that Legionella is indeed a very important public health problem, and that you all here at the Hot Water Forum actually stand in a key position to do something about it. I hope you will all download and read a copy of the report, as it's free to the public, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have during the QA period. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy. That was a great introduction to Legionella. Our next speaker is William Rogue, who is a postdoctoral researcher at Virginia Tech. His research explores applied environmental microbiology and chemistry in building drinking water systems. Today, William will be presenting on how flushing best practices can control Legionella. His presentation will highlight existing research on flushing as well as limitations and knowledge gaps. So I will turn this over to William.
Okay, thank you. So that was a great introduction from Amy and an overview of all the different strategies and ways that we think about controlling Legionella. And one of the most common ones that people try to implement at the building level is to flush their water, because they've likely heard that if they avoid stagnation, they'll avoid issues with Legionella. And while that's true in many cases, there are some exceptions. And so I wanted to highlight some of those exceptions. And then Tim will come in after me and talk about the very important aspects of design and how we can more effectively design systems to prevent Legionella growth. So I do want to acknowledge several individuals that have contributed to, my personal thinking and education on this topic. And so I'll just kind of leave this list here for folks to see the different organizations and people that have contributed to this topic. And I wanted to start off by saying, or kind of explicitly detailing what happens during stagnation and why we have this connotation that stagnation is bad. So the first part is that when you have water that's not being used, of course, it sits in the pipes. And during that time, the controls that we have from an engineering standpoint can dissipate. And it can take a very long time to achieve those target water quality parameters after you have a faucet that has been stagnant. So this is an example where the total chlorine residual that we use to prevent microbial regrowth from occurring in our systems took about 80 minutes to reach the levels that were expected at a point of use outlet within a building that was highly stagnant. So it can take longer to achieve our water quality settings. And then during stagnation, the water quality also dissipates. So this is an example where total chlorine residual is decaying over time at an individual outlet. So with these two graphs combined, if it takes 80 minutes of continuous water flushing to achieve a disinfectant residual at the tap, and then that residual goes away within 30 minutes, in one example here, in some outlets, it's possible to never achieve a disinfectant residual. The similar dissipation of target water quality also occurs with temperature. So, of course, temperatures will last a little bit longer if your pipes are insulated and things like that. But even if you're flushing your outlets at 60 degrees Celsius, the water temperature at that point of use will dissipate, and for the vast majority of time that most outlets are, they're sitting stagnant, unused for the vast majority of the time, and the water can remain at growth temperatures for Legionella and other microorganisms and opportunistic pathogens as well. The other thing that happens during stagnation is that biofilm and scales can become destabilized. so that when you flush the water, you can release a large amount of either iron or copper or lead if you have those sources in your building plumbing system. Usually what happens is that the first bit of water has higher concentrations than really well flushed water because those scales are being destabilized. And of course, during stagnation, opportunistic pathogens can also grow and be released from biofilm. And during stagnation, biofilms actually become less stable, so the first bit of water that comes out of your tap is the most likely to have the highest level of microorganisms. And Legionella has a specific relationship with host organisms that are amoeba, and they can grow within amoeba to very high concentrations, and they can be protected from chlorine and temperature within the amoeba as well. So it's easy to imagine that if these amoeba hosts are preventing the exposure of Legionella to the target water quality, like a disinfectant residual or high temperatures, how they could survive within the pipes, even if you're occasionally achieving target water quality. So it's really then about having your water hot enough for long enough and achieving that frequently enough that that Legionella growth is not permitted. And so hot enough is very clearly defined, as Amy outlined. If we generate hot water above 140 degrees Fahrenheit, then Legionella can't grow in the tank. And if we distribute it and recirculate it above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, then it's not going to grow in the main distribution system either. But at the individual taps, there is, when you flush your water and you achieve your hot water temperature at the point of use, it'll be there, but again, it'll dissipate over time. So it's about determining how frequently you have to do this. And in most cases, or some cases, regular use at the distal outlets will be enough to achieve this. But in some, rarely used or infrequently used outlets, it might require people to go in and manually flush the water. But I did want to point out that sometimes you can have unintended consequences from this type of control strategy. And so I wanted to talk about one experiment that I did during my PhD dissertation, where I operated pilot scale hot water systems that had a regular residential water heater with this recirculating loop. And I had two identical systems. One system was 40 degrees Celsius, and the other system started at 40 and was gradually increased to 60 degrees Celsius. And off of the recirculating loop, which was continuously recirculating 24/7, I had simulated distal outlets that were flushed 21, 3, or 1 time per week to simulate high, medium, or low use frequency. And all of this was conducted without a disinfectant residual present to test worst case scenario water coming into the water heater. And so what we're going to look at is what I call a regrowth factor, and it's on a log scale. So a value of 1 on this graph indicates that there was 10 times more Legionella pneumophila in the distal outlet than in the recirculating line. And a value of 0 indicates that there was no change or no regrowth in the distal outlet compared to the recirculating line. And I really wanted to highlight just kind of the most critical result here, where when we were operating our water heater at 123 degrees Fahrenheit in the recirculating line, the distal outlets that were flushed just once per week seem to have thermal selection for Legionella growth at those individual distal outlets, as opposed to the medium use and high use taps, which were likely used frequently enough to inhibit the regrowth of Legionella. But essentially what we think was happening was the 123-degree water was coming into the outlet once per week. It was disinfecting a lot of the microorganisms that were at that distal outlet, but the Legionella were potentially surviving within amoeba hosts. And then after the thermal kind of shock, it had dissipated during the stagnant conditions. The amoeba and Legionella could then regrow. So this is an example where, even if you're operating at kind of the recommended settings, there are a subset of scenarios that you can have unintentional selection and amplification of Legionella. So what that means is that flushing alone is likely not the solution or the only thing that you want to rely on when you're trying to deal with Legionella problems. You want to deal with the design of the system as well, which Tim will talk about. So in terms of when you should flush and a little bit of how you should flush, for flushing of water heaters, remedial flushing is really necessary after prolonged stagnation when the water heater tank has been very, very stagnant. And through this practice, you're temporarily decreasing the contaminants, but it's not a long-term solution. And it should be noted that incomplete flushing may actually temporarily increase the level of contaminants as well. So for instance, if you're using manufacturer recommendations, if you completely drain and clean and refill the tank, if you do this inefficiently, then you're basically going to be disturbing and resuspending some of the debris and sediment that accumulates at the bottom of tanks. For remediation of Legionella, it's better to just focus on turning over the entire volume of the system by flushing at a drain valve, for instance, at a high flow rate or the highest flow rate that you can to turn over the entire volume of the system. And if you're flushing at this drain valve, you can turn off the heater and just flush until the water becomes totally cold, or you can estimate the time needed to flush based on the volume and the flow rate that you're flushing at. In some instances, regular or routine flushing of water heaters may also be necessary if you're not able to or you're not operating the water heater at the recommended temperature settings. If you're operating them too low, then you'd want to flush your water heater regularly enough to try to introduce a disinfectant residual to the water heater as well. So this can be done in many cases through regular use. If you have an appropriately designed system, regular water demand will turn over your water heater and achieve this for you. But it could also be necessary that you actually go through and simulate regular water use. For instance, in the current environment where the stay-at-home orders have decreased building occupancy, it may be necessary to go in and manually flush the water heaters. And when you're doing this, you should focus on flushing both the water heater tank and the recirculating line if it's present, because the recirculating lines are the higher risk for growth of the bacteria. And this can be done manually just by opening outlets or automatically using solenoid valves and timers to routinely do this on a daily or weekly basis. And how frequently you do that can be based on measurements of water quality, temperature in the system that you can document. Okay, so as a kind of final slide here, the limitations for flushing is that flushing alone may not be adequate. It really is highly dependent on the water quality that you're flushing the outlets and the water heater with, making sure that you're maintaining those recommended temperature settings and or chlorine residuals if that is the engineering risk approach that you're taking. It's really not well defined how frequently or how long or where you should flush different building systems. The flushing protocol really has to be optimized for each location based on the mechanical equipment and the operation of the building and what makes sense for the folks that actually have to go out and do the flushing. And then it's worth noting that centralized hot water systems are the highest risk for regrowth of opportunistic pathogens, but risk is generally lower if they are designed, operated, maintained, and installed properly. And the last thing that I just want to say is that if you're going to go out and perform flushing activities, that you should be validating that the flushing practice is achieving the goals that you're trying to achieve, meaning that when you're flushing, you want to document that the temperatures that you're targeting are reached during flushing activities. And then afterwards, you want to validate that your flushing protocol was successful through things like microbial testing, actually testing for Legionella, the bacteria. Okay, and with that, I will thank you for your time and thanks for inviting me to speak. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A. It's always a very good and engaged group here at the Hot Water Forum.
Thank you so much, William. That was a really great overview of flushing. And I do want to point out that we have gotten a few questions, and I think we'll go through with Tim's presentation and then turn back to all the questions for Q&A at the end. So with that, I'll introduce Tim. Tim Keene is a consulting engineer with the Legionella Risk Management Incorporated. Tim is an internationally recognized expert on methods for controlling Legionella and building water system designs. Today, Tim will present on how to design plumbing systems to mitigate Legionella risks. So, Tim, I'll turn it over to you.
Anna, thank you. And Amy and William, great job. I like hitting cleanup because what you brought, I can tie some of these items together, I think, for the people watching. CDC released an MMWR. This was written by public health experts, and it says there's 4 main root causes of Legionnaires' disease outbreaks. These are process failures, human errors, equipment failures, and unmanaged external changes. Unfortunately, these public health experts missed the most important item, design issues. Legionnaires' disease outbreaks are more often than not caused by plumbing system and equipment, design, operation, and maintenance issues. This is the most important issue to address. Unfortunately, when those with no engineering background investigate outbreaks, they frequently miss issues related to engineering, design, operation, and maintenance. So many think energy savings and Legionella are competing issues, that actions to improve one will worsen the other. This is true if you take a building designed for 3 GPM at the fixtures and basically install a sock at those fixtures, an orifice, to reduce the flow down to 0.5 GPM. You then turn those drop legs into dead legs. Talk about getting the cart before the horse, dramatically reducing flows at the fixtures without changing codes and water demand calculations allow for dramatically smaller distribution pipes that will greatly increase potential for Legionnaire's disease. ASHRAE 90.1, published in 1989, was the first document to recommend in public restrooms 0.5 GPM and 110 degrees Fahrenheit. This was an energy-saving standard, but it also greatly increased the risk for Legionella growth in plumbing systems. Here's an example from a case study of a project I recently worked on. The original spec softeners were 140 GPM. This was what was installed in the hospital for service of capacity, and the peak demand was 190 GPM. We found that these softeners completely consumed all of the chloramine in the incoming water supply, and chloramine's extremely stable, extremely difficult to destroy. These softeners did it. Essentially, these softeners acted more as a bioreactor than a water softener. They were so grossly oversized, the velocity so low, the retention time so long, that it destroyed all the incoming city water disinfectant and grew a ton of bacteria in the meantime. We did a study, found out that the demand on this plumbing system was 15 GPM during normal load and 35 GPM peak demand for hot water makeup. These softeners were hot water makeup only. So we replaced the existing softeners with these newer softeners that were 55 GPM service capacity, 78 GPM peak capacity, and a 1.5-inch inlet and outlet valve. So what does this mean from an oversized softener? Well, the oversized softener gave us longer retention time in the softener, more water aging. It destroyed all the cold water disinfectant. It yielded high bacteria growth in the control valves and the tens of thousands of resin beads in the softeners. And because the oversized softener was so big and we had to regenerate it every other day to keep bacteria level down, we were using 15 times more salt than was needed. And because the water during regeneration to drain was much higher, we were wasting large volumes of water in the regeneration process. Data confirms everything else in the plumbing system was equally oversized. The hot water return piping, the hot water return pumps, the cold water supply piping, the hot water supply, cold water supply headers and risers, and the heaters. The facility came with 4 heaters designed to operate in unison. In the end, only 1 heater was needed, and it was only at partial load. Give you an idea of how oversized everything was. So what's the impact of this? Well, the original softener is shown in pink with the average velocity of 0.68 feet per second. It was essentially a stagnant water dead leg at all times. The softener we replaced it with at 15 GPM, the average velocity was 2.72 feet per second, exactly where we want it to be. And the peak velocity was 6.35 feet per second at 35 GPM. So think about it. This is the norm because codes are way outdated, that plumbing and associated equipment is grossly oversized, making that equipment and that plumbing the potential to be a dead leg. What's the net energy impact of this oversized plumbing? Larger pipes, greater surface area, dramatically greater heat loss. Flushing mains to drain to control the bacteria, greater water consumption, and greater heat loss. And what's the net Legionella impact of this oversized plumbing? Basically, turning the whole system into a dead leg under normal operation, extremely high risk for bacteria growth. So what can be done about it? In hotels, apartments, hospitals, showers and rooms require a central hot water system. What about office buildings, educational facilities, conference centers? Do we need large central hot water circulating systems there? On-demand water heaters and zoned hot water systems in lieu of large central hot water systems will dramatically reduce energy and dramatically reduce Legionella risk. We don't need 120 degrees to wash our hands in a restroom. 80 degrees is more than enough. Same way for science labs in schools. Gyms, cafeterias need greater than 120 degrees for showers and washing. With on-demand zone heaters, we can get that done. This document is IAPMO UPC code Appendix N. I think it's the single greatest plumbing code change directed at reducing Legionella risk. It has correct Legionella growth and scalding risk ranges. It addresses issues created several decades ago when a huge safety factor was added for temperature and scald risk. 130 was recommended for water heaters, but 120 was substituted because it was thought if 130 was good enough for scald risk, 120 would be safer and there would be no downside. At the time, we didn't know at 120, is a huge downside because of the great increase in Legionella risk that we've learned since then. So in this chart is highlighted the places you don't want to be: 85 to 110, the absolute worst place for Legionella growth; 110 to 120, moderate Legionella growth; 120 to 130, as William mentioned, extremely low scald risk and extremely low Legionella growth. So what's the net impact of on-demand heaters and zoned hot water? Eliminate hot water distribution systems, zero circulation losses, no balancing issues. If circulation is needed, you will have smaller lines, smaller hot water return pumps, and the hot water return pump can be operated only when needed. Guidance for Legionella control is to operate central hot water return pumps 24/7. But if you have a conference center that has a conference scheduled from 1 to 3 p.m., you can turn on the hot water return pump at 12 and give good control of hot water with the least amount of energy consumption. Net Legionella impact for on-demand heaters, zoned hot water, absolute lowest possible design risk for Legionella growth. Water stays cold until needed. In the cold water, you have higher disinfectant residuals, and you have no balancing issues. So listening to what William said earlier about flushing a water system, add this on top of it, flushing a system that began with being grossly oversized makes it that much more important that flushing of all these components be done extremely well if the system's been stagnant. I wrote a document developing and building potable water system flushing program. It goes through in detail engineering guidance on flushing and velocity, and you can find that document on my website. Addressing these issues in hot water system plumbing and components design and sizing, as well as operation and maintenance, will save energy, water, space requirements, consumables like salt, installation and operational costs will go down, and dramatically reduce the potential for waterborne pathogen growth. That's it, Hannah.
All right, thank you so much, Jim. Now we can turn it over to our Q&A section. I have a few questions to read out from the audience, and then from there, if the audience members have anything else they want to submit, they can submit it in the Q&A bar, and we can begin answering them. So the first question was for Amy, and it says, could demand response enabled hot water heaters, which hot water to high temperatures when electricity is plentiful, be combined with low flow appliances to reduce the risk of Legionella?
So I saw that question, and I think Tim actually ended up doing a much better, more detailed response to that. But I'd say from the perspective of the Academy's report, I think we focused more on low flow faucets and whatnot in referring to problems with green design. At the time of the study and the literature review, there wasn't much out there that demonstrably showed that on-demand heater systems had lower Legionella numbers. But maybe, that's not to say that new information hasn't come online. I would agree with what Tim shared in terms of theory, that it makes sense that on-demand heating systems could be designed in such a way that could both reduce the energy demand and reduce the potential for Legionella to grow and cause a problem. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Tim.
No, you got it, Amy.
I think, William, did you also answer this question? Do you have anything you want to add to what Amy said?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that Amy's response and Tim's presentation kind of nailed it. So I don't have anything to add.
Shoot, sorry, I was on mute. We had another question from Amy, from Jim Lutz. It says, Amy, thank you for the presentation. Are you recommending 60 degrees Celsius at hot water heaters and 55 degrees Celsius to the distal points in single-family homes?
That's an excellent question. So the report was really making those recommendations for large institutional buildings. What the report did say is we really don't know much about single-family homes. I think in principle, the same theory applies that hotter water temperatures would be helpful in any situation. But I think the issue is that the code, it gets really complicated, and I myself am doing my best to learn, but it's very local and state specific and doesn't generally factor in Legionella. And so it would be nice to have that factored in better. But the report in general calls for a need to learn more about sporadic disease, the potential for single-family homes to be a source, especially since we don't know where 95% of disease is coming from. That suggests that single-family homes are a source. And I think another angle is, educating people if they belong to certain risk groups. So we know that being over 60, smoking, having other conditions, lung issues, can put an individual at risk. And so it'd be nice if, there's integration with healthcare. So we mentioned these centers of excellence, for example, where there's more communication from doctors like, oh, you fall into this Legionnaires risk group. These are things you might want to be aware of, So for example, travel is something that puts somebody at risk of Legionnaires, for whatever reason. One might be hotel stays, but just building awareness so that people can protect themselves. Like, now I would say, me knowing what I know, if I'm in a risk group, yes, I would probably, in fact, I did. When I started working on Legionella, I, went down to the basement and turned up the temperature on my water heater. But that's me speaking, not necessarily the committee.
Yeah, thank you for that response. We have quite a few more questions coming in, so I'm going to try to power through them. So we got one for Tim from Peter Grant from Beyond Efficiency. And it says, thank you for showing the slide presenting Legionella growth risk as a function of water temperature. I found that slide very helpful. You also have data on how long water must be at those temperatures before there's enough Legionella growth to cause a health risk. For example, water can be at 100 degrees Fahrenheit for 20 minutes before it's likely to become dangerous.
Studies done on that, and there are charts showing that above 140 degrees, you kill the Legionella within seconds, above 130, within minutes. Below 130, it could take more than 30 minutes to kill the Legionella. William and Amy might have those numbers off the top of their head. But that's research studies and lab studies. Bottom line, if you keep a hot water heater at 140 at all the time, you're going to kill the Legionella. If you keep your hot water and the hot water return circulating at above 120, 121, somewhere around there, the Legionella will not grow. William and I investigated one project where they were using temperature as a control measure, circulating hot water at above 130, coming back in the hot water return around 150 going out to the building. But all the drop legs, all the lines from the circulating line to the fixtures basically had zero disinfectant, because at that temperature you're killing all the disinfectant. And they had serious issues over multiple years with the bacteria growing and getting positives and having multiple years of outbreaks. So regrowth is an important question. Looking at the design, operation, and maintenance of the system. This building had mixing valves at every fixture, which complicated the factor. I hope I answered your question. And Hannah, I can shed a little bit more light on Amy's previous question I do have a 500-unit apartment complex I've been involved with since 2010 that had a significant outbreak. It has individual hot water heaters, so that's 500 electric hot water heaters. We have been testing them, and we did find, to control the Legionella, we had to put master mixing valves on these hot water heaters. For that small unit, I think they're only about $120 a pop. We are maintaining the hot water heaters at 140, and we're putting water out to the apartments at 130, and we did find that controlled the Legionella. Prior to doing that, we had serious issues with high levels of maintenance, quarterly flushing of mains. The only thing that stopped it was putting on these master mixing valves. And again, these are electric, which are much higher risk than gas hot water heaters due to circulation and design issues. Okay.
Wow, thank you so much for adding to Amy's previous question. We do have a few more coming in. So it says from Larry Weingartner, hi, might storage water heaters still be appropriate if some sort of disinfecting technology were added to the hot outlet of the tank? And that's not directed towards anyone in particular, so if anyone of you want to answer that. Do any of you work with storage water heaters?
I can take a shot at that. So I think that there are certainly scenarios where tank water heaters are appropriate. I mean, I think, the theory is that the on-demand systems are beneficial for, in terms of limiting storage, getting your disinfectant residual through the hot water. But there are some systems that, they cannot install an on-demand heater without also doing some sort of water softening. So there are situations where tank water heaters, have to be used, and I think that they can be used successfully, if they're operated in the way that we've been talking about above, making sure that you're generating hot water above 140 and then tempering it down for distribution. I would personally avoid a design where you're intentionally operating it at a lower temperature and dosing in a disinfectant. I think that, dosing in disinfectant is very, very simple and easy if you're doing it in a short-term remedial fashion. But long-term, it can trigger all kinds of regulations depending on what state or municipality you're in, and requires a licensed operator and a whole bunch of other steps that, if you can avoid, I would certainly avoid to keep it simple. Simple is safe. Yep.
Thank you for that response. Amy, Tim, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
Me too.
So the next question is from Rick Mayo. He says, has this been tested? If an electric tank style water heater is left off, then retro commissioned at 140 degrees Fahrenheit, does that kill all the Legionella bacteria?
You didn't point that to anybody, so I'll chime in. This is Tim. The problem with electric style heaters is, of course, in a gas heater, the gas is at the bottom of the heater. It heats the water at the bottom of the tank, and then natural circulation allows the heated water to flow to the top and the cold water to circulate to the bottom, and you got a nice loop. You have no dead legs. In an electric tank, the coil is in the side of the tank, typically 6 to 18 inches off the bottom of the tank. The coil and everything above will get heated. Anything near the coil below it will get heated, but anything at the bottom of the tank may not get heated. And of course, if you have a 2-element system and the bottom element is bad, then the entire third or bottom half of the tank may not be at the right temperature. But if both elements are good and you have the tank set for 140, and 140 will kill the Legionella within 30 minutes for sure, then what's coming out of the top of the tank has a very low risk if you're maintaining that 140 even though at the bottom of the tank you may still have live Legionella. If you have a big demand where you get a lot of circulation in the tank, turn on several fixtures at the same time and basically mix up the water, you could mix that Legionella in the bottom of the tank, get it in the circulation and bring it up to the tank top, coming out with the 140 degrees water, and the 140 will not instantaneously kill the Legionella. So that's the problem with electric style tanks, and that question really hits it well. Thank you.
Yeah, and then on top of that, we got a comment from Gary Klein, also on electric storage water heaters, and he said that we need to know what the temperature is in the tank below the lower heating element. There is very little evidence that the lowest few inches is much warmer than the building temperature. That means that under certain set point temperatures, say 120 degrees Fahrenheit, there's a high likelihood that there is a band of water that's spent practically all of its time in the optimum Legionella growth range. So that kind of just reiterates what Tim had responded to that question. We have another question from Devin Holder. And it says, hi Tim, can a local small contractors deploying water softeners in single-family homes ensure that they are sized properly to not strip out all the cold water disinfectants and balance that against regions where the water source is very hard?
So Devin, to answer that question, size is extremely important. If you oversize the softener, you have longer retention time. You have more channeling, more bacteria growth, more disinfectant destruction. So you really want to, if you do anything from a safety standpoint, undersize a softener and not oversize it. The other thing is, look at what ASHRAE has some guidance on softener applications. If you're below 100 ppm of hardness, you really don't need to soften the water for cold water supply. You should only be softening hot water, and that way the heat will kill the bacteria that the softener may create. If you're softening all cold and hot water supply, then you're softening water that's going to be used for consumption and that won't have heat killing the bacteria. So you really want to make sure that softener is not causing a problem by being oversized. So look at the sizing guidance. If the softener says 35 GPM, or in a home, you're looking probably 5 to 10 GPM for service rate. That's what you want to do. Don't look at the amount of fixtures. If you can, get a water meter reading and calculate what their average water usage is or what their peak water usage is, and size the softener according to that. Good question. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. We got another question asking, is UV light an effective method against Legionella? That's not directed towards anyone, so.
Well, William can speak to this more, but I know that in the lab, when we actually install water heaters and plumbing, like the system William talked about, I know that the university makes us put a UV light at the end before we route everything to the drain as a safety measure. But in practice, I think Tim or William would have a better idea.
Yeah, UV light is very effective at killing Legionella, but there are a couple of issues. One issue is shielding within the amoeba, so it's a little bit unclear to me that it's fully effective if they're entrained inside of an amoeba. But we have not seen any evidence that they do have breakthrough. But the bigger issue for UV treatment is that it is really only effective for the planned use and does not provide any control beyond the point where it's applied. So if you're disinfecting the water as it goes into your water heater, it could grow in your water heater. If you're disinfecting the water as it comes out of the water heater, it can regrow in your recirculating line and distal legs. It seems not a sustainable and feasible approach to install UV light on every single fixture at the point of use. but maybe high-risk fixtures, that could be a precaution. But my feeling is that you have more efficient and sustainable ways of controlling Legionella growth using other methods in buildings. You're muted, Tim.
Certain UV systems will also destroy the disinfectant. So if you're putting in a UV on the cold water supply, you could be at the same time destroying all the chlorine coming in from the municipality and leaving the building with no residual disinfectant, and accordingly becoming a public water system in some states, because they say if you change the disinfectant level in the water supply, you become a public water system, and the UV could essentially be removing it. So that's one of the downsides with some of the UV systems. And William's exactly right. If you put it on the hot water going out to the building and it's still in the circulation lines, there's no residual disinfectant. It only kills where it's located. Hannah?
All right. I think we're right at 4:15, so I think we'll wrap this up and hop over to the Skype call for any more questions. I do want to thank everyone for joining us today, and I especially want to thank all our presenters. This is a great session, and I'm really excited to see where the conversation goes in the Skype meeting. So thank you, everyone.